Well, hello and welcome back. I did a stream this morning and here we are again. Welcome back to my page. Thank you for the sub, Doug. You didn't have to do that, but thank you. 9 of 12, thank you for the sub. Thank you. You guys, you don't have to do that because it's for free. The class is for free, you guys. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you for being here. We're gonna get started right at 5:30, but I thought I would pop in because all I'm doing is sitting here and waiting for 5:30 to roll around. So we can just check in, we can chat for a little bit, and we're gonna get started pretty quick here. Yeah, don't want ads interrupting. Yeah, I don't have ads enabled or anything like that, so we should be fine. I have a fun little Steam bot that's been disabled. Yeah. Hello. Nice. All right. Excellent. Happy to hear it. Thanks for joining, Rob, in 9 of 12, September. JD? You unfortunately cannot disable ads. Oh, I did not know that. That's good to know. Well, there you go. I thought because I didn't enable them that they were disabled. But here we are. So no, don't worry, I will wait for a little bit. We're still early. It's not even 5:30 yet. But if you're not early, then you're late already. I've got my miniatures in front of me. I've got my spiel ready to be spieled. Are you learning D&D? No, we're learning miniature painting. Hello, Diggity Dog OP. We're learning how to paint miniatures today. Will still show when someone first comes if they aren't subbed. Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. Good to know. Oh, sorry. Very neat. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. This is not done. I'll have to change the title. But this is a beginner class of miniature painting. The very, very beginner of miniature painting. We've got 2 minutes. This is what my classes are like. Usually when people are early for my class, I'm like, hi everybody, hello, welcome, da-da-da-da-da. Rob prepped my miniature for D&D and that's awesome. I'm glad you still have your Minotaur. That's so fantastic. I was so jazzed when I was able to contact them and get that time to get schooled. Yes. Hello, Aspire. Hello, my buddy. Excellent. Happy to see you all here. So the format of how we're going to run things tonight is I'm going to do a spiel, and then I'm going to be switching back and forth between this screen and the overhead camera screen so you can see what I'm talking about a little more up close. Hello, Hatter. Thanks for popping in. So we're going to be switching back and forth the screens, and so that you can see a little bit more up close what we're dealing with. All right, so off we go. I'm going to lower the music down just a little bit more. Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to the very beginning of beginning miniature painting. So this is like beginner class. My name is Courtney, and I am figuratively speaking minis, not to be outdone by imposters, which I had to deal with this morning. No, I am the real one. I am Courtney, and I wanted to let you know that I absolutely love this hobby. I fell in love with it about 6 years ago in 2018, and it's been a passion of mine ever since. I paint for about 6 hours a day, though I'm trying to tone it down a little bit. But I've been teaching for 5 years, and one of the things that I really love teaching are beginner classes, because I feel like I have the ability to help people take the pressure off themselves to actually nail it the first time and spend a bunch of money doing it. That's not the case. You can do it on a budget, and you can do it for fun, and you can do it however makes you happy. So we're here today to talk about how to get into the hobby, what their tools are, the paints are, what they're used for, and then we're going to talk a little bit about beginner techniques such as basing your model with paint, doing a wash or a dry brush. So that being said, we're kind of going to dive into the beginning. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, but I'm not going to answer any questions until I pause my spiel and invite questions. So that being said, what do you need to paint a model? What tools and what items do you need to get into this hobby? If it's something that you are getting into because you want to play Warhammer, you play Dungeons and Dragons, you play any other tabletop board games that have miniatures in them, you might find that you want to kind of eliminate the gray and add some life to your characters. And we do that by painting them. And there are varying degrees of skill that is involved. We have terms such as tabletop ready, display, competition, and different things like that. For our beginner class, we're going to worry about tabletop standard. Tabletop is a great standard to be at. All it is adding a bunch of color to the model so that it's not gray, that it's engaging, and that you have fun playing with the model from whatever gaming system that you are using. One caveat and one little just like asterisk, this is all my opinion, and this is all what I have learned because I was self-taught. If you disagree with a technique, if you disagree with the paint or the options of brushes that I present to you, that's okay. You don't have to agree with me, and you are more than welcome to explore all the other options. And if you need recommendations on who else to follow or who else to go learn from, I've got such great resources for you. So just because I say it doesn't make it 100%, there is a varying degree of opinion here. And it's your job too to develop your own opinions as well. It's your hobby journey, so you enjoy your journey. And if I'm not to your taste, that's okay. There's a lot of other people. Yes, we highly encourage, go out and explore. But if I'm your base, at least you kind of know where to start. And I think that's a good place to be. So when you're beginning your hobby journey, you might be, again, buying board games with miniatures. You might be looking into wargaming, or you might be playing Dungeons and Dragons. So there are multiple different brands of models that you can find out there. And they include Reaper, Reaper Bones, WizKids, Warhammer, 3D printing, which is huge right now. We have filament 3D printing and we have resin 3D printing. There's also metal miniatures, which are a little bit phased out. They were more popular a few years ago, maybe over a decade ago. But they are still on the market. You can still find them. There's pewter, metal miniatures, and things like that. Or sometimes the older ones are made out of lead. So what are the benefits of each material? Well, plastic miniatures, they don't break as easily. So board game miniatures are mostly plastic. And you'll find that they are much more easy to drop on the floor without breaking them. So that's a pro for plastic miniatures. However, maybe some of the details might be obscured on them, so you might not want to use them if you're, painting to a higher quality. The WizKids ones are great. They kind of are budget friendly. They come primed already, so you don't have to worry about priming that model. So there's a benefit to that as well. 3D printing is accessible through your home. You can buy a 3D printer and use resin or filament or anything like that. So there's a benefit to that. So you always have a printer at your disposal. We love that. For me, I print anytime I feel like painting something. So that works for me. Warhammer is on a plastic sprue. So that's a sheet of plastic. And you have to clip them out. The benefits of Warhammer are that you can, customize miniatures. There's lots of different options for weapons and heads, and terrain, things like that. And metal, now I'm a little biased. And so this is the caveat. This is where the little asterisk comes in, because I don't like metal miniatures at all. I find them incredibly difficult to use and paint. But some people really like them. They just really like them. They like the material. They like the heaviness in their hand. So this, and it can be cheaper and they're available, right? So each has their pros and cons. It'll be up to you to kind of dabble in the ones that you want first. Like if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you might pick up WizKids. But then I encourage you to maybe try a metal miniature and see how you like it. You might like it more. The metal ones, however, they do have more obscured details. They're not super crisp or anything like that. Then you might find that there are some boutique miniatures that are like a high cast quality resin, super detailed. They're incredibly expensive, but you might treat yourself to one of those types of miniatures as you progress in your miniature painting journey. It might be really beneficial to you to keep one of those handy when you want to like really push yourself to be a better painter. So those are pros and cons to kind of each type of material. Where can you find these models? Well, we know board games. Board games are kind of everywhere right now, which is really awesome. Reapers are everywhere. WizKids are kind of everywhere. You're looking at hobby stores. You're looking at game stores. You're looking at online eBay. You can order them through websites. You can go to Etsy. You can get things printed. They're widely available. And usually, if you can't find it, you can sculpt it yourself. And there's sculpting, software and everything like that for 3D printing. So it's out there and it's all quite accessible. However, shipping can kind of be expensive every once in a while. So just, you can pretty much find them anywhere. Okay, so now we're going to switch to my screen down here. So in front of me, I have some Warhammer models. These are the ones that are plastic that you clip off the sprue. And I'm going to show you some of my materials here to prep the model with. So when we have procured our miniature, we are ready to sit down and paint it. But wait, you can't paint it yet. But why, Courtney? Because you have to prep it. When you have board game miniatures like this one, this is from a game called Talisman. And these miniatures, you can see, are quite shiny. Ooh, what is that shininess? That is a chemical called mold release. And with the plastic miniatures such as Reaper or board game miniatures, you're going to encounter mold release. This is a chemical that won't let paint adhere to it very well. So one of the ways that we prep the model is that we wash it in warm soapy water. Sometimes people use a cloth or a paper towel or a toothbrush and they give it a little bit of a scrub. And that way it gets that mold release off and you can prime it. So after you wash off the mold release, we are going to prep the model by removing any of the mold lines. So where the mold comes together in the plastic, like there's a seam that runs down it. That line collects paint against it. So, and I always say, do as I say and not as I do. A lot of the times I shave down some mold lines, but I'm not too meticulous about it. But if you want your model to look as crisp as possible and as smooth as possible, you taking off those mold lines is what's really going to help you. So the tools that we use to take off mold lines can be, we've got hobby knives. These are sprue cutters. That takes the character off the plastic sprue. Varying degrees, sizes of sprue cutters, hobby knives, things like that. Actually, and Games Workshop. This is such a funny tool. I'm so surprised that I have this. Games Workshop released a mold line shaver, and I bought it. So this is designed to slide against the plastic and take off those mold lines and seams, flashing as well, just like that little thin piece of plastic that occurs when the mold is cast. So I never use this. It's not necessary. So save your money and don't buy that. But there are tools out there that are designed to remove mold lines, shave down all the extra plastic bits, clip off. And Dungeons and Dragons frameworks. If you're going to be using Dungeons and Dragons frameworks, you need sprue cutters. You need super glue. This one is a really good one. This is by Creature Caster. And it's just a nice, really liquidy super glue. Another tool that you can use in when you have to build a miniature, such as these Games Workshop ones, is a super glue activator. It does cause the glue to be more brittle, but it is really handy if you need to have that super glue set really fast. Another tool that you can use for when you're building the models is plastic cement. So this melts the plastic for these guys, and you put it on and you hold it in place, and it melts the plastic, and then it grips it and it squeezes it together, and then it glues it. Really great for building. So those are more of the plastic models. But as for board game models, I'm just gonna move it as close as possible. Hopefully that picks it up. You can see just right on his leg, oops, just right on his leg here, there's a seam. Nope. Will you pick it up? And that's where I would use like a hobby knife and shave it down. So we'll just shave that. And you give it a wash for board game miniatures. With the Citadel miniatures, with the Warhammer miniatures, you usually don't have to wash them. They're usually okay. And then we start kind of getting into priming. I just want to make sure. Oh, sorry. Before we start getting into priming, we're going to talk about gap filling. Okay. So sometimes when we have models, either they come, in the board game, or they come on the sprue, and the sprue, it might not connect at the right spots. So what we usually do is we use items like green stuff. This is almost like, this one's liquid, although mine's a little dried out, but it still works really great. You fill the gap in, and this is a 2-part epoxy milliput. It's a sculpting putty. You roll it out, you apply it to the hole or to the gap, and you smooth out the edges and kind of make it all nice and flush. And that also helps because if your model has gaps or bubbles or things like that, again, the paint will collect against it and it won't look as good. Okay, so for priming the model, yes, there's lots of different brands of gap filler. Those are just a couple. And then I have another one by Vallejo. It's a plastic putty as well. Yep, that one works just fine. All of it is kind of the same thing. It dries hard. It's a good material to work with and a good gap filler. So these guys, what I have are primed already. So they come in like green plastic. I prime them. There are many different kinds of primers that you can get as well. There's brush-on primers. So we've got a brush-on primer like Pro Acryl or AK Interactive. There's so many brands of primers, brush-on primers. There's rattle cans. So we got Citadel rattle can. So that's a rattle can. And then there's airbrush primers. So a primer that will shoot through the airbrush as well. Primers through the airbrush are really, really fine spray. They do such a great job. But airbrush primer, if you don't have an airbrush, it kind of defeats the purpose. So your best bet are brush-ons or rattle cans. You can prime using a rattle can in cold weather. It can be done. I have done it. I live in Canada. I have rattle can primed in about minus 40-degree weather. It just depends on your technique. It depends on how fast you are, because that paint is going to freeze in the air if you're not fast enough. So that's something to keep in mind. make sure you are in a well-ventilated area, no matter if you're using an airbrush or a rattle can. Just if you're using a brush on, it should be fine. But there are colored primers as well. So there's red, green, off-white, yellow, red. Did I say red? I think I said red. Brown, black, brown, bunch of different colors. And I personally don't use a lot of colored primers, but if you are working on an army, say with Warhammer, it might be beneficial for you to prime in a color. Might consider it. Especially if you have a lot of models. Might help. I've never used colored primers, but I think they perform the same way. The point is to get a fine spray so that you're not obscuring the details when you're priming. And then there are techniques such as this one where it's a zenithal prime. So you prime in black and then you shoot white on top, or you can dry brush white on top. And that's part of the slap chop method, which we're not going to be learning today. One day I'll do a video on slap chop. But this is a zenithal prime. And for me, it helps catch my eye and it like focus on different details. If I can see the shadows and the highlights really easily, and if I can see where the source of my light is coming from, I feel like I can paint a little bit better knowing that. And it also provides natural shadows and natural highlights, depending on how thin you paint. So that is a zenithal prime. Why are we priming also? To help the paint stick to the miniature, especially if we are playing with these models, we're touching them, we're moving them across the board. The oils from our hands will pull up paint if it's not primed and varnished. So that's something to keep in mind too. All right. Now, this is one of my favorite topics. We're kind of going to dive into tools. What tools are there or accessories for us hobbyists that will not make us a better painter, but help us on our painting journey? And tools include painting handles. And there's so many different kinds of painting handles. So what you will find on the market, I have other ones too. I have so many painting handles. These ones are spring-loaded. This one's from Citadel. This is a spring-loaded handle for multiple different sizes of miniatures. I actually even have the bigger one too. So if you need bigger handle, we've got a large handle, we've got a small handle. We've got handles that rotate and come with different caps so that you can not have to turn your miniature upside down and all that kind of stuff. You can just hold it in your hand and use your fingers to turn it. I had this one custom made for me by a friend. It's just something that is comfortable that sits in your hand. This is all sticky tack on the top. So these have sticky tack on the top holding your model in place. You can use jars, shot glasses, film canisters, old bottles. You can use mason jars. It doesn't have to be fancy. The point of a handle is to keep your fingers away from the model. Not only, again, are the oils from your fingers going to disrupt the paint, but you could smudgy your paint job. And we don't want to smudgy our paint jobs, especially if we're working so hard on a model and if you're manipulating it and you don't realize that this back part didn't dry and you touch it, oh no. Now you've got a giant fingerprint on his back, and that's not going to be easy to kind of come back from. You'll have to do another layer. You'll have to combat the texture that was created with some semi-dry paint, the dry paint, and the wet paint. So you'll be combating that. So you want to use, prescription bottles are great as well. Everything like that. Then we have wet palettes. Now, it's in my humble opinion that I think every beginner should be using a wet palette. It doesn't matter if it's expensive. It doesn't matter if it's super expensive. As long as you have found a model of palette that suits your budget, because you can go to the dollar store, you can get a sponge, you can get parchment paper and a Ziploc container or a container that has a lid, and you're golden. That's what you need. That's it. So this is from Redgrass Games. It is a basic wet palette. It has a tray here. It's just magnetic. But as you can see, all it is a sponge, thin sponge, palette paper, and there you go. You wet the palette paper, you make sure that you don't leave it too long because it can get moldy. Although some of the palettes that they have now are like microband, like it's really cool. So that's an option, but I highly recommend a wet palette. Now, the thing about wet palettes as well is you don't want to oversaturate it. Like you don't want this to be a huge puddly mess. You can see there's no water in my palette at on the bottom currently. So we can add a little bit of water, but it's just enough to keep the sponge moist and the paper moist without, we don't need water pouring out of the palette. So this is just, it's moist. It's holding the moisture. Yeah, you don't want water pouring out of your palette. That's too much. Okie dokie, Smokies. What else is there? Oh my gosh, there's so much more. Don't worry, we're going to get to questions in just a quick moment here. We're going to talk about, we've got paint mixers. So if you don't want to shake that bottle of paint, there's Vortex paint mixers. And what it is basically like, test tubes, and it rattles the test tube. That's what a Vortex paint mixer is. A lot of estheticians use it for mixing nail polish. They're expensive. They're not necessary, but if you have maybe some problems with your grip or some fatigue in your wrists and hands, a paint mixer might be really beneficial for that, to help mix your paint so that you're not hurting yourself mixing or shaking your bottles of paint. Lamps. My room is lit up like a Christmas tree in here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources of light. It is really a good idea to have excellent sources of light so that your eyes don't get fatigued, and that you are using light that is pure white, not warm, not cool, something that's very, very neutral. It'll affect your paint job if it's a cool light versus a warm light. So a nice medium is the way to go. I also like to keep a hairdryer. I like to paint fast, so I want my paint to dry faster. There are some cons to using this with plastic models, board games or WizKids or Reaper. It melts the plastic, so you have to be careful. But if you want to melt the plastic, this is a great tool to do that and like repose your miniature. Keep that in mind. But having a hairdryer handy is really good. A fan and different things like that. Now I'm going to pause for questions because the next thing that we're going to talk about are brushes. So if anybody has any questions at this time, let's just throw them in the chat and I will answer them. If there are no questions, we will continue in the next 2 minutes. That's a great question, Aspire. Yes, I have used airbrush primers as paint-on primers. They do work. They work just fine. They are so much thinner though, so it may be deceiving that it's probably not, you don't need an opaque layer of primer from an airbrush. You can paint it on and then go from there. Like it doesn't have to be completely solid. But yes, I have used airbrush primer for priming miniatures with a brush. Okay. What kind of a throwback question? And welcome to the chat. Thank you so much for your question, Tenor Mech. Are there 3D printing services in the community that you recommend? Yeah, I have some great friends that are 3D printers. I really like 3D Print Den. I really like Nyan Cat. I like Owlbear Creations. No, is it Owlbear? If you DM me on Instagram, I can give you a list of all of my favorites. But I usually and primarily buy from 3D Print Den. 9 of 12. Is there a good way to take off paint and reset a mini you're not happy with? Yes, there are ways to strip a model, and that includes using chemicals such as like Simple Green or Detol. There are ultrasonic cleaners that you can use as well. With all of those, you have to let it soak, and then usually you're scraping off the paint depending on how thick you put the paint on. I never recommend those stripping models. I recommend if you have the money to buy a second model, do that and keep your old paint job so that you can reflect back on it, or even maybe just take pictures of your paint job before you start trying to strip it. I have personally stripped with Detol, Dettol. It's an antiseptic cleaner, and it's a concentrate. And what I do is I put my miniature in the jar and I fill it up with Detol, and I put the mini in and I let it soak for a day or two. And I find I can peel the paint off after that, either with a toothbrush or with a Q-tip, and it comes off fairly clean. I haven't really had a problem with it, but I haven't stripped a model recently. So I'm sure in the comments, if other creators or commenters want to tell how they strip a model, feel free, but it's usually just a really heavy cleaner. That is correct. Thank you, Aspire Painting. Yes, if you are working with metal, the paint's going to come off really, really easily. That's another pro to metal miniatures. However, and a con to the plastic or the resin models is that you can start to melt the plastic. So you have to be very careful with that. Check after a day of soaking, things like that. Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. If you have super glue or plastic glue, it can affect the glue as well. So that's why I don't really recommend stripping miniatures. If you can afford to buy another model, maybe of the same kind, I would go that route first. Okay, so we are moving on to brushes. Here we go. Brushes. Now, I'm going to show you all of my main brushes. That's not a brush, that's a knife. These are my main brushes. I have a mixture between Amazon Bulk Buy dry brushes, my first dry brush that I ever got, my new one, and then I have Bulk Buy Amazon flat brushes. And then I have just a wide variety of model brands and fibers. It is not the brush that's going to make you a better painter. It's all in how you're going to be using it. Let's just put that out there. I don't care what anybody says. If you use a bulk buy brush versus a synthetic versus a real Sable hair brush, it's not going to make you a better painter. It's all in how you use your tool. So this one's an Army Painter. Very soft brush. This is a Broken Toad Kolinsky Sable brush. So Sable is an animal. So wherever you lie on the moral compass of using animal products, just know that some brushes in the art world use animal fur. This is one of them, Sable hair. Then I have a brush made out of wolf hair. This is from Chronicle Cards. That uses wolf hair. And then we have, these ones are wolf hair as well. And then we have the synthetic. So I have a bunch of synthetic brushes as well. So imitation Sable. And these are all synthetic. Now, are there pros and cons to using synthetic versus Sable? I would say, you know what, with nowadays with today's technology, we're looking at some pretty amazing engineered brushes. People might argue that a Sable hair brush allows moisture and the paint to flow off the brush better. Okay. And imitation or synthetic haired brushes might hold on to that a little bit more, might be a little stickier, might not have the flexibility and bend that a real hair has. As a painter, you're going to learn what kind of painter you are and how hard you are on your brushes. And I'm a painter that is very hard on their brushes. I damage brushes very quickly because I demand a lot out of that tool. I paint a lot of texture. I paint fur. I paint scales. And my brushes don't last long because I am so hard on them. However, I've had this brush for over 3 years and it's lasted me because I take care of it with brush soaps. No matter what kind of brush you have, it is always a good idea to use a brush soap to help the paint come off of it. Because if you start getting paint in the ferrule over here, your bristles will split. They will come apart. And what that looks like is this. See how it's nice and fluffy on the end? Yeah. This is a terrain brush now. We only use that one for terrain. But you would like to maintain the point. The sign of a good brush is a brush that has a fat body and a sharp tip. Because we are working with detailed models, we need that sharpness of the tip to get into those details, to apply the paint where we want it to be. The fat body of the brush holds the paint, holds the moisture, and allows the paint to flow off really nicely. We are not wizards, and we do not hold the brush like this. This is not going to give us any kind of control of where the paint is going. No. Stop painting like this. This is not good. If you're painting your model like this, hang on. If you are painting your model like this, it's not good. Not only is your hand going to get super cramped, you're not going to be able to have the control over where you apply that paint. You need to choke up on your brush. You should be holding your brush like a pencil. That's how you should be painting. And that's going to give you the most control. Okay? So with brushes, back to like price point, whatever brush you decide to get, keep it within your budget. Again, they don't have to be expensive to start off with, but eventually if you want to treat yourself to a Winston, Rosemary & Co., if you want Monument Hobbies, if you want a Vallejo brush, if you want, something that, a lot of other people are using, treat yourself later. But if you are a beginner and you're just practicing, keep your budget simple. Like, I'm not going to say buy the dollar store brushes because I think those are a little bit too low end, but keep it around like a hobby or an art store. And the Citadel brushes are great to start with. The Dungeons and Dragons Army Painter brushes are great to start with. What else is a good brand to start with? Vallejo, AK Interactive. Those are all really great brands. They're fairly budget friendly. They're a great place to start. My favorite is the Dungeons and Dragons Army Painter set. Like I said, I've had my Dungeons and Dragons set for so long. Like, I still have, 6 years later, my Dungeons and Dragons dry brush, and I've had to throw out my basing brush because I got super glue on it, but I still have the detail brush. So, and if you treat your brushes good, your brushes will treat you good back. And that's my spiel on brushes. I'm not going to get into the debate on is Sable better than synthetic. I think they both have their pros and cons. I think when it comes down to it, a big con is cost, but I think they function the same. And if you know how to use your tool, you're going to get the results that you want. Period. That's my opinion. Does anybody have questions about brushes? Put it in the chat now. I'll give you a couple minutes. One thing I will say is, I don't know if anybody knows, pencil grips. Sometimes when we are teaching kids to write, we give them a pencil grip. And it might be beneficial to you if you have a hard time with your brush in your hand, if you find your hand getting cramped, is to invest in some kind of pencil grip and put it on your brush. Yeah, there's lots of different brushes out there. You got to just kind of trial and error a lot of them and see what breaks down faster. Learn if you are a painter that's harder on your brushes versus a painter that, you're quite gentle with your brushes. So that might work in your favor if you're more gentle. You won't have to replace them as much as I do. That's why bulk Amazon works for me. The next topic that we're going to be launching into is paint. A bunch of different kinds of paint, what they do, why we use them, what they're good for. What size of brush do I recommend? That's a great question. The standard is a size 2. So usually painters were painting with a size 1 or 2 brush, though a size 2 is always a good basing brush. Anything smaller and you're starting to get into detail work, and the smaller the brush, the faster that the paint and moisture of the brush is going to dry. So if you live in a dry climate, working with a detail brush such as this one and how small that is, if you have your heater going or your office is really dry, you go from palette to model, the paint might already be dry on such a small detailed brush such as this one. So again, that's why we want a fat body and a sharp tip, because this can do all of the things that you need it to do. It can base, it can detail without drying out. It holds more moisture. So I usually recommend a brush of this size to start basing, or this size is pretty good too. One that I'm painting with quite often right now is the number 2 from AK Interactive, but you can see the number 2 from AK Interactive is quite a bit smaller than the number 2 from Broken Toad. So it's all really in personal preference. But you want the brush to be able to hold the moisture and hold the paint for longer. Don't work with a smaller brush just yet. Work with something a little bit oomphy, a little bit more body. Give it some oomph to it. Hello. Welcome. I'm not running a campaign. This is a miniature painting class. Yes, welcome. So the next thing that we're going to be diving into are paint brands. And what that is a heck of a lot. I think the market has exploded for paint brands. Like, honestly, like when I started painting, there was like Citadel Vallejo, Model Color. There wasn't a lot. Now we've got boutique brands, or maybe I just wasn't exposed to them at the time. But you know what? We've got a lot of paint brands. Yes, I understand that. On Twitch, there is no miniature art. There is no miniature painting title. So we're in Dungeons and Dragons. That's what we're doing. I was thinking about doing Warhammer, like titling this Warhammer, because the miniatures that we are doing is Warhammer, but I want it to be kind of all-encompassing. It's not just Warhammer. It's Warhammer and board games and Dungeons and Dragons. Anyways, okay, paint brands. There are many paint brands. Vallejo, Citadel, Model Color, Army Painter, Monument Hobbies, Game Color, P3, Chimera, Tooth and Coats, Pro Acryl, I already said that. Monument Hobby is Pro Acryl. And there's air paints, there's contrast paints, there's Army Painter, there's AK Interactive, we got Monument Hobbies, we've got Model Color, Chimera, we've got Vallejo. There's so many different brands of paints out there. Each one has their own unique properties, which is kind of funny when you think about it. When you look at a bottle of AK versus Army Painter, what are the differences? Well, price. Why are they priced different? Is because of how they're made. So and there's Reaper paints, Army Painter, yeah, I've said all of those. The point is the cheaper the bottle of paint, the less pigment that it's going to have. It's going to have more acrylic body and less pigment. The more expensive a bottle of paint is, you're going to be paying for more of a pure pigment rather than the acrylic body. What does that mean for your painting? It means if you have a higher pigmented bottle of paint, you will need less of that paint and it thins down much more easily. Then there are some finishes. This is a satin finish. Satin, glossy, matte. Matte does not, it goes kind of chalky, whereas satin gives a little bit of a shine, but nothing like glossy. And then there are contrast paints that are made, or speed paints that are made to be incredibly liquidy with a lot of pigments that settle in the recesses, so this one flows. And as you can see, there's a lot of different kind of caps too. Like we've got paint pots and we've got squeeze bottles. So that also plays into like what brand of paint that you want to buy, because if you don't like the way that this bottle behaves because this tab falls off constantly and like this. Yeah, so this bottle of paint, like the tab fell off. I used my teeth to open it. You know, that might be a deterrent for some people when buying paint, is they want something that's a little bit more durable, something that can withstand shelving for a longer period of time. The Citadel bottles never close properly. It could be a huge pain in the butt to close this bottle of paint. This one like even broke off, and as you can see, the paint can coagulate, it can separate. That might be a huge deterrent because this bottle of paint is over $6, right? This bottle of paint is like $3. But this bottle of paint is super thick. It's gonna last long, and you can thin it down quite a bit more than this paint. This paint is not gonna give you an opaque layer maybe for 3 or 4 layers. Like, it's not a strongly pigmented paint. This one is airbrush paint. Airbrush paint, you can use it to brush on a model as well. These bottles are expensive though, so it's not in your best interest to use them as brush on paint. But that's what I say. But I do use them as brush on paints quite often. So I like them because they're so thin. They're already thinned down so much. Obviously, they have to shoot through an airbrush. So they've got the pigment, they've got the thinner. You can paint them on really easily, and it dries really fast. So that's like kind of like, I really like airbrush paints for brushing on. I think they're great. But again, they're really expensive. But yeah, your mid are AK Interactive, 2 thin coats. Your Pro Acryl, you're getting a little bit more expensive, but you're also getting more paint in the bottle. So that's something to think about. Paint is going to be a huge personal preference. But I will say that you want your paint to be satin or matte because it's our job as miniature painters to mimic light. We don't paint with glossy unless it's an effect like blood or saliva and things like that. So keep that in mind. Then we have things like metallic paints. Metallic paints are paints that have actual pieces of metal in them. And I know Brent from Goobertown Hobbies just did a little chemistry thing where he was brushing and microscopically looking at the coverage of different paints, metallic paints. Metal Color Air is a great metal color metallic paint. Pro Acryl, I recently just started using them. I think they're great. I tend not to thin down my metallic paints though. I try to use them with a moist brush, but not an oversaturated brush, and I tend not to thin them down. Metallic paints can also damage your brushes because of the little metallic flakes that are in the brush. Do not use your really nice, expensive brushes with metallic paints. Go for something synthetic and cheaper because your brushes will break down faster if you're using metallic paints with them. Okay. So another medium that I use are inks. And this ink is from P3. It's turquoise. I really like inks. Let me just grab my Dollar and Rowney ink to show you. So I also use these. These I get at a hobby store. I really like them. I use them for shooting through my airbrush. I use inks to thin down my paints. That way I can maintain the brightness, the oomph of my paint without using water breaking down that chemical formula too fast. So that's something that you can dabble in if you want to start dabbling with inks. I recommend them. They're a great addition to your paint, your basing. You can make your own washes with them. Now we're going to talk about washes. Okay, so washes are a type of paint. Washes are shades. That's what they're called. Highly pigmented, very liquid, not as pigmented as the contrast paints. They look similar, but they do two different things. These ones are very thin and they settle into the recesses. They tint your model, they darken your model, and they're made to be very liquid and bring down the brightness of your model. So usually when after you use a wash, you go back in and you rebase it, or you highlight it. But they come in a multitude of different colors. One of them being brown and the other one is black. These are like what they say is talent in a bottle. It's you put it over your model and it just really settles against the recesses and creates shadows. It allows your model to pop, all the details pop. I will show you what that looks like. You can dilute washes. You don't have to though. But for example, let's use this guy because he's nice and bright. Do you see how it kind of just settles in against that and it makes all of those details kind of pop? Some people like to paint a wash on their model to kind of, if the model looks a little too one color, like for example, this one looked very, very white. It's kind of hard to see the details. So if you do a little wash over it, you can use that as a tool to find out where all those details are and go back in and paint them. So that's an option too. There are other things that you can add to your paint, such as a glaze medium. So if you want to thin down your paint to make a glaze, you can use a medium instead of water, and it just holds that chemical formula a little bit better so that the water doesn't break it down and that you can apply pigment to your model without a lot of moisture. Retarder medium is a medium that allows you to extend the drying period of your paint because usually acrylic paints dry within 2 to 3 minutes, maybe about 5 if it's like a heavy layer. But if you're doing a technique such as wet blending or glazing, you could add a retarder medium and it just takes that drying time and extends it. Then there's special effects like crackle mediums, iridescent mediums, glow effects. My goodness, we've got so many different things. Chipping medium. And they all do something different. And that's something you definitely want to explore. They're the fun ones. They are the ones that, make your model just unique and different, and you can use them in so many different kinds of ways. So it's something to look into. There's so many YouTube tutorials on how to use iridescent medium, crackle medium, glow medium for your models. Okay, now we're gonna pause again. Does anybody have any questions so far about paint and paint brands? I'll give you a couple minutes to put it in the chat if you do. And if anybody is putting a question in the chat, I'm going to get my palette ready because we're going to be learning how to thin our paints. Some of the advantages of using an ink to thin down your paint instead of medium or water is because the ink is pigmented already. So it keeps that vibrancy of the color that you are working with, or you can add black or white and create a whole new color. Welcome to the chat. Thank you for your question. Paint branded primers worth it, or just the standard Valspar works just fine? Yes. I go to Home Depot and I use Rust-Oleum quite a bit. I find it's because it's a budget friendly rattle can of paint primer. I use it a lot. I find that it does spray. The spray is not as fine as an actual hobby rattle can, but it can be used. So if you have a larger piece, go for it. I mean, why not? If you have something that's quite small, I would recommend a hobby can, just because the spray might be fine. Or if you can find a fine spray budget friendly option, it works the same. It's all primer. Yeah, there are so many brands of paint. It's totally what's in your budget. It's what you find personally useful. It's if you like Duncan Rhodes, then use Two Thin Coats. He made a whole paint brand. But if you like, maybe some of your favorite YouTubers are using Pro Acryl, then use Pro Acryl. It's whatever you want to use. You will learn how to manipulate it and get the effects that you want, given some time with it, honestly. They're all so good at this point. There's not a lot of difference between the brands. Yeah, so there's lots of different kinds of spray cans. Test them out, see what you like. Start with the budget-friendly options and kind of work your way up. If you're DIYing terrain, is it worth mentioning that rattle can propellants can melt foam? Yes, that's very true. You need to coat it with something before priming. Yes, Mod Podge and black paint helps seal the foam before you prime it. Be careful with foam. That it can definitely melt it, and there are some toxic fumes when working with XPS foam. Hello, welcome to the chat. I use Joe Sonia acrylic paints. If I have a choice, I use them over model paints every time. Yes, there are some heavy body acrylics like Golden that can also be really, really, really great miniature paints. Stay away from enamel unless you are using it on metal. It dissolves acrylic and can react with a lot of plastics used in mini production. That is true. We do not work in enamel paints. We work primarily with acrylic because enamel paints are not made for what we do. They are very sticky. They don't blend. It's not ideal to be using enamel paints for miniature painting. All right, so now we are going to launch into how to thin your paints. Here we go. Okay. Now again, now that we've talked about different brands of paints, and Each brand of paint is going to have their own thickness. They're going to have their own pigment. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. I always like to say that you want paint to be the consistency of about a melted milkshake. And you're not going to add a lot of water off the bat. You're going to ease into it. So here's my lovely palette. I've got some red paint right here, and it's quite thick. It's quite thick on the palette. As you can see, nothing is falling down off the palette. It's not really going anywhere. So it's pretty thick. I'm not going to just like dump a whole bunch of water on it. As you can see, this brush is just thick with water. No, we're not going to do that. Get your brush moist, dab off the extra moisture, and what that looks like is just a dab, a roll and a dab. Just dab. And then you're going to add a little bit of water each time. I want that to be here. There we go. And just back into your water a little bit at a time. The consistency is that of heavy cream. It's that of a melted milkshake. The point is it's creamy. It's a creamy paint. It's not thick and sticky, and it's not too wet like a glaze. I'll show you what too much moisture looks like. That's too much moisture. Now we're getting into glaze territory, and that's not going to cover at all. Ooh, so thick, so creamy. Well, not so thick. It's creamy. Oh, that's not going to cover anything. That's too much water. Boo, we don't love that. But we love that for glazing, but not for base coating. Okay. So keeping it of this consistency, see how it's still covering the bottom of the palette? It's not spider webbing. It's moving where I put it. We love that. That's a great consistency of paint. Thanks, Amanda. Ooh, creamy. Yeah, so this is too thin, and that's not going to do much for us for our base coat. We're talking base coating right now, peoples. So let's look at what that looks like on a model. So I have this nice creamy red. Sorry, I'm going to move my palette off just because I don't want it to focus on my palette. I want it to focus on my miniature. Choking up on the brush, you can see where my fingers are on the brush. And it does a pretty good job covering in one go. I work in smooth sweeping strokes for the base coat. And I color block. So this guy's cloak is all going to be red. Now, if my paint is too thin, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is that thin watery paint. Do you see what it's doing? It's pooling. And it's like just tinting it. And it's not smooth. And you can see the brush strokes. Brush strokes. I should talk like this. Sean Connery. So it's just not thick enough to cover, right? I know, right? Ew. That's not fun at all. Now, when I say base coating, we're going to start getting into technique now. So we talked about paint. We talked about thinning your paint. Now the first technique is base coating. We talked about brush control. We talked about how thick your brush should be, what size you should be using. You never want the paint to go up into the ferrule of the brush. We talked about that. Okay, so base layer. Yeah, it can create a tea stain effect. So the base layer should be fairly opaque, if not 100% opaque in the first 2 layers. Okay. I always start with a darker base coat and work my way up to a highlight. So that could be layer 1. Think of it like a burger. Layer 1 is your bun. That's your first base coat. It should be fairly opaque. Layer 2, I mean, unless you have mustard and mayonnaise on your burger. We won't go there. We'll just talk patty. So you have a patty, and that should be your next layer. Mini and ketchup, yeah. So, but I like to just think of it kind of like you're stacking things, right? So you have your base layer, maybe your second base layer, maybe your mid-tone, maybe a second layer of mid-tone, and then you start getting into the highlights. And you're working in smaller and smaller and smaller areas. So for example, this red is quite bright, and I would probably pick this as a mid-tone to start with. And just remember, you guys, it's just paint. We don't have to take ourselves too seriously. So I'm just going to paint a darker red over top of it because I want this to be nice and dark for my first layer, because that's where the shadows are going to be. We're creating depth. You can even mix colors. I mean, why not, right, guys? Don't be afraid of trying new things, making mistakes, having a few models that you can kind of just do whatever with. It doesn't have to be perfect every single time. But see how this is a fairly opaque base layer? It's not 100%. But the next layer that we do, it will make it 100% opaque. And if you have a Zenithal Prime and you just want to glaze, you'll keep that Zenithal underneath. Or use contrast paints or speed paints. And you don't have to worry about being so meticulous. I mean, yes, we don't want the chainmail to be all red, but don't worry. You can go in and fix it later with the metallic paint that we're going to be using. Thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. Welcome to class. Class is in session. We are miniature painting tonight. Okay, so there's a great first base layer. Now, when the paint is shiny, it means it's not dry yet, so don't touch it. And don't go back in with a wet brush and more wet paint, because the chances of you pulling up paint are high. Let it dry, move on to a different section of the model, okay? The reason we work in such thin layers is that the models are so detailed. If we work with thick, undiluted paint of any kind, it's just going to obscure the details. You always have to thin your paints. Always. And so we set it down and we let it dry. Now we can move on to metallic paints and paint the armor, but I want to open up the floor to any questions so far. I'm going to talk a little bit too about a few tips and tricks. Yes, white paint. Okay, so tips and tricks with white. White is a very difficult paint. You will find across a lot of paint ranges that white paint is chalky, chunky, and it doesn't really behave the way that you want it to. I find it very beneficial to thin white paint with white ink because it keeps that opacity a little bit higher. It keeps the pigment high because when you start adding water, it behaves poorly. Using a medium instead of water might help. Excuse me, but water is a little bit, or sorry, white is a little bit tricky to use. Same with yellow. Yellow across the board you will find is a difficult color to paint. When you are priming, always consider the light or type of color that you're going to be painting on top of. So if you paint a model, or if you prime a model black and then you want to paint yellow on top of black, the amount of layers that you're going to have to paint over that black is going to be 10 times the amount if you paint it maybe with pink or with brown or with white. Prime it before. The trick with yellow is that you usually undercoat it in bubblegum pink, brown, pinks, colors like that, and then you paint yellow on top. Yellow is a very difficult color too. With white, I would recommend white primer, and then work with grays as well. Incorporate a lot of different colors of gray into your model as well, because white can be, the black shadows against white can be too harsh, so you're working with probably bluish grays, things like that to shadow white. Yeah, white or gray primer is always a kind of an easy place to start, or a zenithal prime where it's black and then you shoot white on top. It's always nice to have that option too, of like the black creating your shadows for you. But with a zenithal, you also just don't have to use black. You can use blue, you can use dark gray, you can use red. Like a zenithal is just a prime on top of a prime, and the prime on top is usually white. So you can use any color underneath as well. And that might be a really cool effect that you might want to do. Like I said, shades or washes will darken your base color. So if you have a nice vibrant red and you decide to put a black wash on top of it, so the wash is the next stage in my beginner tabletop ready process. So if you decide to use a black wash, I also have a red wash and I have a brown wash, but just for demonstration purposes, we're gonna use a black wash. If you apply this on your model, it will muddy, it will darken, but it also brings out the detail. Pros and cons, my friends, pros and cons. So you can add that wash. The washes do take longer to dry than acrylic paint. So washes do take longer to dry. You're looking at about 7 minutes instead of like 2 or 3. Yes, if you're using transparent paints, speed paints, contrast paints, glazes, things like that, a white prime is always the way to go. Yeah, don't prime your model black if you're using contrast paints or speed paints or glazes. I'm just gonna shoot this with a hair dryer, so give me 1 second. Okay, so it's not as shiny anymore. You can see there's still a little bit of shine in the corner there. That's okay. We're gonna go back in with our base color, and we're gonna brighten this baby back up because that black wash darkened it so much. But here's how to make it a little bit easier on yourself. Don't paint the whole thing base color again. Just start hitting the highest points of your model in sweeping strokes. Lots of control on your brush. I'm leaving the crevices dark because that's what the wash did. It created some shadows for me. And just putting the base color back where the light is touching the model. And then I'm even going to add the second layer, some brightness. Bring back some of that bright red. Hit the highest points on the model. And always wash your brush every 2 to 3 minutes, regardless if you're using the same color. Keeping that brush moist is going to allow your brush to have the paint flow off of it. Keep it moist, not oversaturated. We don't want it to be dripping water, but you want the paint to be flowing off as you're painting. And the only way to do that is having a moist brush. So it doesn't matter if you're painting everything red. Keep your brush, wash it every minute or so, like honestly. And it's so dry here where I'm from that the paint dries on the brush so fast. Now, there we go. So we've got some brightness back. I know it's a little bit difficult to see. I'm working on getting a better camera. So if anybody wants to help me out with that, I am working on getting a better camera. I'm working on it. But we brought some of the highlights back with the red. We've got our dark shadows in the folds. Now, highlighting. So let's talk highlighting. We want to bring it up to the next level. We want our model to have a lot of contrast, right? The more visually contrasted your model is, the more it's eye-catching. That's why hockey jerseys are the colors that they are. That's why movie posters are blue and orange all the time. You know, like the contrasting colors, I recommend beginners get a color wheel. Put it in front of you. I have one on my palette. I have one on my wall. I have one that I use for teaching. And it's just really handy to see really quick visually what's the opposite of red. Well, it's green. I'm not making a Christmas one today, but you know, like you're working with warm and cool tones, things like that. You can always play with color temperature. And that's something to keep in mind as well. For your tabletop ready beginner model, don't worry too much about color theory or contrasting colors, but you do want to create a little bit of space in your mind for how can I make this really kind of pop, right? And working with colors, we highlight within the same color family. So red is a little interesting because if you add white to red, you're getting pink, and we don't usually highlight red with pink because that makes it a whole different new color. So the things that you can do to highlight red are add some yellows or oranges to your red paint, and that creates a little bit more of a vibrant red. Or if you're within the same paint range, that's a benefit to working with different paint ranges, is because you have a color family such as this. This is the brightest of the three of these colors, right? So you can base in this color, have a mid-tone of this color, and highlight in that color. Easy peasy, right? It kind of does all the work for you. Where it's going to get a little tricky is if you, for example, you have to maybe think about it a little bit more with other paint brands and things like that. But yeah, adding a little bit of bright orange to our red. I'm going to shake that real fast. creates a reddish orange color that we can use to highlight the tops of the folds of the cloak. I'm using a technique called edge highlighting. That's a little bit more advanced, but you can kind of just use the point of the brush to get just the smallest. We work in smaller and smaller and smaller sections, the brighter that we go. Get the edge of the cloak. Get this nice big flat part right here. We're going to make sure our brush is nice and moist so that the paint flows off of it. Just do a nice layer. Sorry. Around all of the bumps and high points. And eventually you get a model that has nice high points, dark shadowy low points, and that looks really good on a tabletop. Now there's other ways to achieve this really quickly. It's a little bit messier, but it's called dry brushing. Now I actually recently just got these ones because I primarily use flat brushes, and where's my other dry brush? I use these a lot for dry brushing, but I recently saw someone working with these. Now there is a brand out there that is really popular with people. I've never used it, but this is very similar, and this was $8. These set of 8 brushes were $8. Or makeup brushes, they're really great. But this is a dry brush, and the technique is exactly how it sounds. But the difference is you're not using diluted paint. You are using paint straight out of the bottle, not thinned down. And what you do, I'll show you my palette while I do this. So you got here, we got this lovely orange color right here. We're gonna dip the brush into undiluted paint. We're gonna put some paint on that brush. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a lot of that paint off. Okay, now it was like, yeah, you took a lot of paint off. What's the point of that? The point is you're ridding the brush of the acrylic medium, leaving the pigment on the brush. And then you take that and you just lightly caress the highest point on your model, the highest bits and points on your model. So if you don't want to do the layering technique, you can dry brush. And it does get to the same point. It's a little bit messier. You might have to go back in and around the spots that you don't want the dry brush to be. But it highlights really nicely. You don't use a wet brush to dry brush. So you'll have to, once you use your dry brush and you get the color and everything off of it, you have to let it dry unless you have another one, and then keep going. So that's an option too. So if you don't want to layer by layer, hair dryer for the win. Yes, so that's a bonus to having a hair dryer as well. So today what we did is we kind of learned about all the tools, how to get a model, how to find a model, what kind of models are out there. We learned the technique of base painting, base painting, and then layering, and then highlighting with a dry brush and a wash. So that's really all that you need to kind of know to get a model tabletop ready. At this point, does anybody have any more questions? Hello, and thank you for the follow, Mr. Biscuit, or M Biscuit. I like that name. That's a good name. Paint journals, yay or nay? Ooh. I did kind of make a paint journal, so I should say yay. It's free on my website. They are very beneficial if you are working with a scheme that you need to remember. For example, if you're doing an army and you have a specific formula for each paint, yeah, I recommend a paint journal. But if I personally don't use one, but I do recommend them. It's handy if you need to remember how you mixed your paint, to get the colors that you did. For example, I made a color this morning. I made this color this morning on this figure. So I am painting a bat, and I custom colored his wings. And I don't remember the colors that I used to get there, but I have the paint here. So it would be very beneficial to me to have that formula if I need to go back in with that base color that I put on his wings. However, now I didn't write it down. So yes, I would probably recommend a paint journal if you're just starting out and mixing colors. Does anybody have absolutely any more questions? Yes, 100%. We love Zenithal highlighting for contrast paints and speed paints. AAA, there are a lot of kits for paints from companies. In your opinion, what is the best bang for your buck and for which company? Great question. I love that question. There are so many great kits right now. Like, you're right. There is so much out there. The best bang for your buck, I would have to say, are Model Color or Game Color by Vallejo. I recommend them because they are affordable, but the pigments are good. They are good. They're better than Army Painter, you guys. I highly recommend Vallejo over Army Painter if you can. The price difference is about $1.75 a bottle. So it's not a lot, and you get more bang for your buck, and you'll get more longevity out of the Vallejo rather than the Army Painter ones. So I recommend the model color or the Game Color. Hello and welcome to the chat. Thanks for popping in. We're here just kind of wrapping up our first miniature painting beginner session. I'll change the title so that people aren't confused. This is not Dungeons and Dragons. This is painting Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer and board games and all that good kind of stuff. Varnishing. Yes, there are so many kinds of varnishes that you can get. I recommend varnishing models if you are going to play with them. If you're not going to play with them and if they're more of a display piece, I don't recommend varnishing because varnish can sometimes go frosty or add texture if it's an old varnish or if it's a clogged can and things like that. So be wary. Keep in mind, you can spray through an airbrush, you can buy a rattle can, or you can paint on a varnish. The varnish will 100% wreck your brush if you are using brush on varnish. Just chuck the brush when you're done because you cannot save it, in my opinion. It very much can dull the colors. There's UV resistant resins or varnishes. Hang on and I'll grab the can. And you are always gonna varnish in matte. Not satin, not glossy. It has to be matte varnish. Non-yellowing, moisture resistant, and dries in minutes. That's the goal. This is a Krylon. You can get other varnishes from other hobby brands. Oh, and if you're working with contrast paints, you can varnish and gloss. This is the only time I would recommend gloss, is if you're working with a wash or a contrast paint and you want it to be super, super, super smooth, varnish and a gloss, and then paint on your contrast paints or washes. That's a whole other kind of technique. Dana Howell uses that. She's amazing. She's an incredible painter. So if you want more tips and tricks about different things to make painting go faster, or kind of more obscure tips that it's kind of risky, I have some recommendations, so you can definitely DM me on that one. But I do not varnish in satin. I just don't recommend it because I find satin varnishes can go glossy if not properly shaken. So I don't usually recommend satin. I usually recommend matte. So that wraps up the beginner class. That's it. Those are the techniques. I want you to go forth and paint your little hearts out. I want you to try. I want you to buy, if you can, different models, different paint brands. You don't have to buy a whole set. You can buy a bottle or two here and there. Try it out. Try different brushes. Get a feel for what you like, and don't be too swayed by the opinion of the influencers that you see. Just try everything, and don't be afraid to just dive in. It doesn't have to be perfect. It is frustrating to begin with, but you'll get there because it just takes time. And if you have the time to practice, you too can ace these techniques that you'll see in the future. I'm hoping to do an intermediate class where we talk about blending, wet blending, crosshatch, and stippling. Thank you for the subscription. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I was like, follow, subscription. No, thank you so much for the subscription. I truly appreciate it. I'm hoping to do a class on blends. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate you guys. You're the best. Oh, Aspire, thank you for gifting the subs. You're too sweet. You're just the best. I need to give you a high five. So that being said, in the future, I'm hoping to do those classes where we talk a little bit more about color theory and blending, and then more brush control and how to achieve those blends. You're so sweet. And it's absolutely my pleasure to answer any questions in the future. If you have any, you can DM me on Instagram. I am primarily there. You can also email me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Threads. I'm on YouTube. I'm on here on Twitch, but primarily on Instagram. So if you want to ask any questions as they come up in your painting journey, or if you need resources that direct you to YouTube videos or products specifically, let me know. I have a ton of brain space dedicated to this hobby. So I know things. I know a lot of things, and I know where to find them. So yeah, let me know if you need help with anything. Go forth, base paint your model, give it a wash, give it a dry brush, see if you like those techniques, and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for coming, you guys. I need a t-shirt that says that. I paint things. She paints and she knows things. But don't drink your paint water. Keep the brush out of your mouth. Wear a mask or have well-ventilated systems if you are airbrushing or varnishing or spray painting or whatever it is. Protect yourself, protect your eyes, protect your back. Make sure you're comfortable. And thank you all so much for popping into my class. My first class online. It was good. Thank you guys so much for joining. I'm so happy that you came. And I'll see you. I'm painting tomorrow morning. We're painting the bat again. So if you want to join me for that stream, you're more than welcome. It's a paint and hang. It's not serious, but if you have any questions, it's a great place to ask questions because I'm there. So there and live. Have a fabulous night, everybody. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Between what I know